Good morning. My name is Thomas Sloan, and I'm a research associate with the Public Policy Institute of California. Welcome to our virtual program featuring the findings from our Criminal Justice Research Group's latest report, assessing the impact of COVID-19 on arrests in California. For today's virtual briefing, my colleague and report co-author Deepak Premkumar will present the main findings from our report. Following Deepak's presentation, he will be joined by Magnus Lofstrom, report co-author and policy director of criminal justice here at PPIC, for an audience Q&A session and conversation about the report findings. Before we begin our program, there are a few housekeeping items to cover. Today's event is supported with funding from the PPIC Corporate Circle and the PPIC Donor Circle. The report and slides from today's briefing can be found on our website at ppic.org. As a public charity, PPIC does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. If you have a question about the report findings, please send an email to the address on the screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. Please include your name and organization along with your question. And now I'd like to welcome my colleague and report author, Deepak Premkumar.
Thank you, Thomas, for that warm introduction. I'm thrilled to be here today to be presenting our report, assessing the impact of COVID-19 on arrests in California. This is joint work with my co-authors Thomas Sloan, who you just met, Magnus Lofstrom, who will be moderating today's Q&A, and Joe Hayes. So we're here to study the impact of COVID-19 on the criminal justice system. Over the past 3 years, the COVID-19 pandemic has imposed significant disruptions on society, and the criminal justice system was no exception. We've seen persistent decreases in arrests that have contributed to enduring declines in the jail and prison population. And over the last 2 years, there's been a growing focus and discussion of crime and what to do about public safety. Overall, in 2020, California saw declines in both property and violent crime, like the rest of the nation. But certain crime types, like homicide, increased. And in fact, both in California and the rest of the country, homicides increased an unprecedented amount from year-over-year changes. And this likely led to both Californians and Americans in general growing more concerned about crime. In response, law enforcement practitioners and people in the California state legislature had proposed and implemented a handful of different policies to address these public safety concerns. However, to understand the efficacy of these policies, and discussions about policing, crime, and public safety in general, topics that have grown in focus since the COVID-19 pandemic, the underlying policies should be informed with an understanding of what happened during the pandemic. Were these concerning increases in homicides an aberration, a transient artifact of the disruptive nature of the COVID-19 pandemic, or will these trends persist, something we should be keenly aware of and respond to with public safety related measures? Now that backdrop and motivation provides an understanding and appreciation of why we took on this report. We're working to examine arrest trends during this first part of the pandemic, early 2020 through mid 2021. Notably, crimes are not arrests. For an arrest to happen, a crime needs to be reported. Law enforcement needs to identify and locate a suspect beyond a certain evidentiary threshold to effect an arrest. However, arrests are where we have reliable data, and they provide an insightful lens into what happened to the criminal justice system during this pandemic period. So we'll be tracking arrest trends and seeing their downstream impacts on jail populations from early 2020 through mid 2021. We also identified key policies and events that affected the criminal justice system during this period. Primarily, we focus on 4, which are shelter-in-place policies, law enforcement directives, zero bail orders, and the George Floyd protests. This will not be a causal evaluation of any one individual policy, However, we did analyze correlations between the timing and implementation of some of these events and policies and observe changes in arrests. To undergo this project, we had to integrate data from multiple different sources. Primarily, we used data from the California's Department of Justice, this arrest criminal history system. The arrest data contains information on type of offense, level of severity, and the arresting agency. Importantly, it also allows us to understand whether an individual has been arrested previously and the time span between those two arrests. We also use data on public movement from Apple Maps. When people enter driving, walking, or transit requests through Apple Maps, they aggregated that data and provided it to researchers early on during COVID. We also use data on police stops and enforcement behavior from Cal DOJ. And finally, we collect information on zero bail orders, both at the local and statewide level, from the Judicial Council and county superior courts. Now, what are these trends overall during this 2018 to 2021 period? So on the left vertical axis, we have monthly arrests, the number of monthly arrests. On the horizontal axis, we have a time period of months from January 2018 to July 2021. And what we see is in this pre-COVID period from 2018 to early 2020, that arrests were largely stable. They decreased slightly for misdemeanors and felonies. And we see that misdemeanor arrests are just under twice that of felony arrests. However, at the onset of the pandemic, in late February 2020, early March, there was a sharp drop in misdemeanor arrests in particular. Now, these are primarily reductions from low-level driving and drug offenses. We see reductions in felony arrests as well, and we reach this point of a notable finding where both felony arrests and misdemeanor arrests are essentially equal. And this amount, this convergence is relatively stable until at least July 2021. Now, the downstream consequences of this are that they contributed to significant declines in the jail population. So on this figure, on the left-hand side, we have the average daily jail population. And on the right-hand vertical axis, we have weekly bookings into jail. The blue line denotes the weekly bookings into jail. And as you see, early on in the pandemic, after February 2020, bookings into jail sharply are reduced by almost 60%. Now, they rebound a little bit until July 2020, but largely stabilized to reductions of 30% relative to February 2020 levels. And this caused an overall decrease in the average daily population within jails. And this is something that we see that is comparable in the prison population as well, which also saw significant declines during this time period, declines that actually weren't seen since the public safety realignment in 2011. These weren't just caused by reductions in arrests. During the COVID-19 pandemic, jail and prison inmates were released early, particularly those that had less than 30 days of their sentence or were being held for low-level offenses. However, it does highlight that arrests were greatly affected, and this is a unique period that persisted and greatly shaped the criminal justice system. So we're going to highlight 4 main policy area and events that happened during the 2020 period. And one major artifact that we're all aware of is that COVID caused Californians to stay home in 2020, whether that was through mandatory shelter-in-place orders or just concerns about COVID that caused people to limit their public-facing activities. Just over 3 years ago, California had its first case of COVID in January 25th, 2020 in Orange County. Cases started to rise a month later in late February, causing Governor Newsom in early March to declare a state of emergency related to public health. 2 weeks later, Governor Newsom imposed a statewide shelter-in-place order instructing Californians to stay at home. By mid-April, there have been academic studies that have highlighted that mobility was significantly reduced. Californians made 50% fewer trips to works and restaurants, 20% fewer trips to the grocery store. Now, academic work has also highlighted that these changes in public-facing activities cause reductions in certain crime types, such as larceny, theft, residential burglary, and robbery. And this is relatively straightforward if we think that there are fewer opportunities to commit certain crimes because there's less victims in public, and fewer opportunities to interact with the police, in which an interaction may lead to an arrest. Now, not only were there shelter-in-place orders in March, in 2020, starting in mid-November, there were increasing restrictions when COVID cases, hospitalizations, and deaths peaked in California. In mid-November, a state curfew was imposed and non-essential businesses were closed. And LA and 5 Bay Area counties quickly followed with shelter-in-place orders. Now, another key policy that happened during this COVID period is law enforcement directed their officers to limit interactions with community members to reduce exposure risk, both for officers and the public in general. Some agencies actually went further and also implemented some cite and release policies to reduce jail populations. A cite and release policy is a policy in which an individual could be booked into jail, but instead the officer releases them and provides them a summons to court, otherwise known as a non-custodial arrest. And finally, law enforcement engaged in early releases of jail and prison inmates beginning in early March. As we covered previously, one of the larger issues discussed related to the criminal justice system during this period is a zero bail order. And there was a statewide zero bail order imposed in mid-April, which set bail at $0 for most misdemeanors and low-level felonies. There were exceptions for what most people consider the most serious crime types, which are often sexual and violent in nature. However, the zero bail order still allowed bail, a $0 bail from some serious felonies, including some assault charges. What this meant is if you were arrested for an offense that's eligible for $0 bail, you were released immediately after being booked into jail. An important caveat, however, is that law enforcement and a DA could petition a judge to set a different bail amount in the interest of public safety. Now, this policy was implemented to reduce flows into county jails and limit the number of people held there through pretrial detention. It was implemented from April 13th to June 20th, 2020, so just over 2 months. However, a few counties implemented this policy early, and over half of counties kept zero bail in place after the statewide mandate was implemented, or after the statewide mandate expired. Importantly, the 31 counties that kept these zero bail policies in place were 86% of the California population. And by December 2021, 26 counties still had zero bail ongoing, which comprised over 78% of the California population. Now, some individuals in California, particularly those in law enforcement, were concerned that these zero bail orders would have what is called a revolving door effect, in which a law enforcement officer arrests an individual, and then that individual is released and they commit more crime and they are arrested again, cycling in and out of the criminal justice system. Local county zero bail orders in, for example, LA, made exceptions. So if you were arrested on release for another zero bail offense, then you could be held in jail. And finally, the last key event that happened during this COVID period that we focus on in this report is the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, which spurred massive nationwide protests in late May and early June. It's estimated to be the largest demonstrations in US history, and it resulted in large polling shifts that demonstrate that confidence in the police fell to historic lows, both across the country and in the state of California. Academic research has highlighted that after these high-profile police killings, that the involved department conducts fewer low-level arrests, and police stops in that jurisdiction also decline, indicative of evidence that police activity is reduced. Now, we also see that that jurisdiction typically also sees increases in violent crime. And these increases may spill over to other cities, particularly when the police killing is particularly highly publicized, such as in the case of the murder of George Floyd. Recent academic research has also highlighted that the murder of George Floyd resulted in reductions in community reporting of crime. And we should be cognizant of all of these effects as we try and understand how this may impact arrests, which may see particular declines in misdemeanor and low-level offenses. So what do the arrest trends look like during this COVID period? So in this figure, we show you data from weekly data from 2020 to July 2021. On the vertical axis, we show you arrests as a percent change relative to the first week in January. We show it across racial and ethnic groups of both Black, Latino, and white Californians. You'll notice that there are 3 vertical lines. On the leftmost vertical line, you can see that a black dotted line, which is indicative of when Governor Newsom announced his state of emergency, which happened on March 4th. The middle vertical line, the red dashed one, represents the start of the zero bail policy in California implemented at the state level, which is happening on April 13th. And finally, the rightmost vertical line, the green one, represents the murder of George Floyd. If we start at the January 2020 to late February 2020, we see that across racial and ethnic lines, misdemeanor arrests are relatively stable. However, in late February and early March, there is a significant drop in the number of misdemeanor arrests, which reduced to up to 60% of January 2020 levels by early March. By early April. And this happens across racial lines, likely indicative of a broader police pullback in arresting activity. Notably, this happens before shelter-in-place orders, meaning that it's likely that Californians reduce their public-facing activity before the shelter-in-place orders, resulting in large decreases in misdemeanor arrests. There is a slight rebound in misdemeanor arrests from early April to late May, after which there is a small and temporary increase in misdemeanor arrests after the murder of George Floyd. These are primarily focused, these increases in arrests are primarily in low-level drug and driving offenses. And then misdemeanor arrests are at this point about 40 to 50% lower than January 2020 levels. We also see in October of 2020, misdemeanor arrests start to decline as the winter COVID surge starts beginning and people start sheltering in place again. Now, what happens to felony arrests? In this figure, we provide the same information, trends in felony arrests across race relative to the first week in January. We see a similar story in which felony arrests decrease substantially after COVID becomes an official concern across the state of California. We see smaller reductions in felony arrests, however, of 40%. And these reductions are less persistent. There is a rebound of felony arrests from early April to late May, after which there is a large spike in felony arrests, particularly those of Black suspects. For context, it's about a 44% increase in arrests of Black suspects relative to about 2 to 7% increases of other racial/ethnic groups. This increase in felony arrests after the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent protests was temporary and primarily concentrated in property offenses, but also driving and drug offenses as well. As a result, this temporary phenomenon is reduced and felony arrests start rebounding back to early January levels by October 2020. However, the winter COVID surge causes reductions in arrests again, and we see them plummet by 15 to 20 percentage points. Now, what happens if we were to overlay these trends with what we see in mobility? So in this figure, we took the felony and misdemeanor arrest trends and we combined them across race and ethnicity group. So those are shown with different shades of orange, and we overlaid it relative to trends in public mobility during this time period, shown in different shades of blue. So changes in driving, transit, and walking behavior relative to January 2021. We see relatively similar patterns in which driving, walking, and transit substantially declined as COVID became an official concern across California, but also before the shelter-in-place order, likely because individuals and businesses started closing, people were allowed to work remotely. By early April, we see the lowest point of public mobility, where driving and walking is decreased by 50% and transit more than 75% of January 2020 levels. We see a rebound in public movement until late May, similar to trends we see in arrests. And this results in a rebound until October of 2020, where driving and walking is actually 15% higher than January 2020 levels, but transit in California never rebounded nearly as much. Expectantly, we see reductions in public mobility associated with the winter COVID surge of 2020, which begins in late November with their requisite shelter-in-place orders. Overall, we feel like this evidence provides a close relationship between arrests and public movement, particularly in 2020 when arrests changed more substantially. We provide more evidence in the underlying report in which we show county differences support this analysis as well. But we also find other factors play a role. Shifts in policing strategy also contributed. So for this figure, we are showing you changes in the number of stops, as well as the enforcement behavior of the stops that did happen. So let's first focus on the number of stops, which is denoted in light green. We'll be using data from 2020 and the 14 largest law enforcement agencies. And overall, we see trends that are somewhat similar to arrest trends that I showed you for both felonies and misdemeanors. Law enforcement conducted substantially fewer stops, a 40% decline on average. We see it rebound in late May and a significant reduction in stops after the murder of George Floyd. And these trends, with the exception of the significant reduction in stops after the murder of George Floyd, are relatively similar to stops or to the patterns we saw in arrests. However, when we focus on enforcement practices, we see something interesting. In light blue, we show you the number of stops that were enforced with no formal enforcement, meaning that the person was let go with a warning or just let go without a warning. And we see that that becomes far more common than other enforcement practices early in the first couple months of the pandemic. Whereas after June 2020, what becomes more common is that officers cite and release individuals rather than letting them go with no enforcement. And it's kind of indicative of law enforcement trying to reduce some of these sanctions. Now, I talked about previously the concern around a revolving door, especially with reported crime increases. We focused on trying to measure that through examining rearrests within a 90-day time span. And now a rearrest is when an individual is arrested and then rearrested for an offense within a 90-day time span. But we also examine the sensitivity of our measure using shorter time spans within 30 days and longer time spans within 2 years even. Now, in an earlier part of the report that we weren't able to show you today, we found that rearrests have quite similar trends to arrests. But it still may be possible that the proportion of arrests that are rearrests may have changed during the pandemic. And that's what we're showing you in this figure. So the vertical axis shows you the percent of arrests that are rearrests, meaning that the individual was arrested within a 90-day time span of another arrest. Now, is broken into 4 different types. Total arrests means that their initial and subsequent arrests could be misdemeanor or a felony for either. Violent felonies means that their initial and subsequent arrests were both violent felonies. The light green line shows you that the initial offense was a felony and the subsequent offense was a felony, and similarly with misdemeanors. Overall, we find evidence that rearrest trends remained generally stable during this time period, with slight reductions across all rearrest types starting in June 2021. So how you read this is about 42% of arrests were rearrests within 90 days starting in January 2020. And that share decreases to around 32% in July 2021. One notable finding that's different than this is that felony rearrests actually increased during this period from January 2020, in which there were 29% of felony arrests, to 32% of felony arrests in July 2020. Now, this is something that is certainly a cause of concern and something that there needs to be more research to investigate why felony rearrests increased during this period. Overall, felony rearrests, like misdemeanor and total and violent, decreased by the end of the sample period, but notably they're a larger share than misdemeanor arrests. One last thing I'd like to point out is after the murder of George Floyd, where we saw a large spike in felony arrests in particular, we don't see any corresponding spike in the proportion of arrests that are felony rearrests. And as a result, that suggests that the individuals who were arrested after this protest were primarily people who hadn't regularly or previously been involved with the criminal justice system. So what are some of the key takeaways from this report? Hopefully from this report, you've gotten the sense that arrests sharply declined at the onset of the pandemic, and these declines persisted at least through January or July of 2021. These had downstream consequences in California, in both the jail and prison population. And we see these decreases that are primarily focused in drug and driving offenses. Mobility patterns appear to be the primary driver of these arrest trends, and especially when focused in 2020. These mobility decreases occurred previous to the shelter-in-place orders, as did the arrests, and it explains the coinciding reduction of both mobility in winter of 2020, but also the arrest trends. Shifts in policing strategy also seem to play a role, as well as the murder of George Floyd. Overall, when we examine rearrest shares, we found them to be largely stable, but more research needs to be done investigating whether these felony arrest trends, rearrest trends continue and why there were an increase. Now, more research generally needs to be done to investigate and isolate the impact of any individual policy, but we look forward to having that discussion in future research reports. Now we will transition to audience Q&A. It's not too late to ask a question, so please submit your questions to PPIC eventquestions@gmail.com. I'll stop sharing my screen and invite Magnus Lofstrom to join me.
Well, thank you, Deepak, for that detailed presentation, an excellent presentation of this most recent report. So what we want to do now, as Deepak said, we want to go ahead and move to trying to answer some of the questions from the audience. So please submit those. And while we wait for that, I'll start off by asking you, Deepak, what surprised you the most about these findings, and what surprised you the least, and why?
It's a great question. I think what surprised me the most is that how significant of a role mobility played. It's an understudied area, at least in the criminal justice space, and it's partially because we haven't seen the upheavals in society that we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic. It also is relatively intuitive of why these upheavals in public movement would impact things such as crime and arrests. For example, we saw reductions in residential burglary. Well, when everyone's at home, that's far more difficult for someone to do without encountering other people. So recent academic work has tried to integrate our understanding and connections between public mobility and crime and arrests. And I think that's a burgeoning topic that should be explored more. What surprised me the least is probably that misdemeanor arrests were the ones that decreased most significantly during COVID, primarily those that are related to drug and driving offenses. People were out less, particularly, and a lot of people were driving less. These are also less serious offenses. So law enforcement, when they chose to decrease their exposure risk, likely prioritize these to be the ones that they reduce.
Great, thank you. Okay, so mobility then is identified as one of the clearest factors impacting these trends that you just shared with us. Can you maybe explain a little bit more about how this relationship works in practice and what those links are essentially?
Yeah, so it definitely needs to be studied further, but I can provide some theories as to what people have understood as like the connection between mobility and arrests and crime. So for example, as Californians reduce their publicly visible activities, they reduced the likelihood of interacting with law enforcement, and that resulted in fewer opportunities for law enforcement to observe publicly potentially criminal behavior, reducing the chances of arrests. However, what is also a huge factor and a likely larger one is that reduced mobility resulted in fewer opportunities for the commission of crimes. There's the residential burglary example that I mentioned, but also like when there's less people in public, it may be more difficult to rob them. And we also saw reductions in robbery, especially early on in the pandemic. One thing we noticed was also that felony arrests tended to be more sensitive to changes in mobility. And it could be that felony arrests are more reliant on a more mobile population, and as these are typically more victim-centered crimes.
Okay, so it's the sense is then that the mobility really represents fewer social interactions, and the fewer social interactions lead to less crime, and that's partly what we're seeing here as well. So the mobility is kind of a measure or proxy for fewer social interactions. Is that one way to think about that?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. All right. So we have a question here from Andrew Bornhart, crime and intelligence analyst with the Yolo County DA's office. And the question is, how do you define an arrest? Is it one incident where a person could be arrested on multiple charges, including felony and misdemeanor, or is it by charge?
It's a great question, Andrew. So for this report, what we did, we had to do a lot of like deep thinking about how we want to define arrests. What we did for one particular incident is we chose the most serious charge And that's what we defined and focused on for an arrest. So typically for a criminal incident, there are several charges, and we took the most serious one.
And he also has a question, are arrests for warrants or probation or parole violations, for example, in the absence of a fresh charge, are they being counted as rearrests?
That's a great question. I know we looked into that initially, but I'll have to take a look back at the report to ensure exactly how we dealt with that.
Okay, it's definitely an interesting question.
Yeah.
All right, we also have a question from Jeff Freisig, who is the Yolo County District Attorney. He would like to know, what is the PPIC plan to study zero bail impact? And whatever evidence did you have, if any, that zero bail policies contributed to the enhanced felony rearrest data?
Thank you for your question, District Attorney Reisig. It's a great segue. We kind of consider this report to be a descriptive piece that serves as a nice precursor to a second report and research project that's currently undergoing that will be evaluating the causal impact of zero bail. So we certainly plan to study that closely, both the statewide order and local orders across the state, with a report that hopefully we plan to release next summer. As far as what evidence the zero bail policies contributed to felony rearrests, we're still at a point in that with this report, we didn't want to identify any causal impacts of any individual policies. So we did look at observed changes in arrests during this time period of when zero bail was implemented in April versus when it was rescinded in June. We didn't find consistent evidence that a zero bail order had a clear impact, but that is not definitive by any means. We tried to also provide suggestive evidence by looking at counties that continued their zero bail order versus ones that didn't in June 2020. And we haven't found significant impacts of zero bail on rearrest yet. However, we are looking forward to a more in-depth analysis to actually estimate that causal impact. Thank you for your question.
Great, thanks, Deepak. All right, so we're talking, there's a little bit contrasting misdemeanors and felony arrests, of course. And why do you think there was such a dramatic reduction in misdemeanor arrests while the felony arrests show a much more slight decrease?
Yeah, it's a good question. And for the viewers just joining us, there was a substantial decrease in the early months, right when COVID started, of about 60% in misdemeanor arrests and 40% in felony arrests. However, after early April, it seemed that felony arrests largely rebounded to about 5% lower than January 2020 levels, whereas misdemeanor arrests largely didn't recover. They remained at about 40 to 50% lower than January 2020 levels. So why is that? I think there's a few different answers. I think, as I talked about earlier, I think public mobility plays a role. As Californians reduce their publicly visible activities, that may have a larger impact on certain offenses, particularly driving offenses, which seem to be driving a lot of the reduction in driving and drug offenses that seem to be driving a lot of the reduction in misdemeanor arrests. Another possibility is that law enforcement have more discretion when it comes to some of these lower level misdemeanors, and we're directed not to reduce enforcement. So some of the shifts in policing strategy, policies to reduce interactions, but also cite and release policies, I think both contributed to more significant reductions in misdemeanors, and then still reductions in felonies, but not nearly as substantial.
Great, thanks, Deepak. All right, so we have a question from Jamie Joseph, who's a reporter with Epoch Times. Did the research provide any information on how many of those zero bail arrests were homeless people, or is there any data at all that differentiated homeless versus others?
So primarily for the arrest analysis, what we focused on is using the California DOJ's arrest criminal history system. In that, there's no way to distinguish between people who are housed or unhoused. However, if you're interested in that question, the California DOJ's Racial Identity Profiling Act, the data we use to identify changes in stop and enforcement behavior does have information on whether an officer perceives the stopped individual to be unhoused. So although we didn't evaluate that question specifically, that's a great place to go to evaluate it.
Thank you. So I want to come back and talk a little bit about, mobility, since that's really, one of the key takeaways of this report is that what we see in terms of the patterns and the trends of arrests coincides to a pretty notable degree with changes in mobility. And you've covered that on the statewide. You alluded to the fact that the report also includes some analysis of the counties and differences across the state. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you found in terms of those differences or similarities in the patterns across geographic regions?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, one of our main findings we found was this connection between mobility and arrests at the statewide level. But to provide more suggestive evidence of this, we looked at within that connection within counties. So what happens when you look within San Francisco County versus Kern, for example? One of the more notable things about San Francisco in particular, and this has been studied by us, but also in the academic literature, is that San Francisco had the most dramatic declines of mobility of any major city in the US. And that's studies that have been done in the rest of the academic literature. The number of visitors that have come to San Francisco for work or for tourism dropped from 26 million in 2019 to about 10 million, which is a dramatic decline that likely played a role in some of the most staggering walking declines that you see, even when comparing similar counties that had similar shelter-in-place policies. Like San Francisco had dramatically lower walking walking percentages relative to other Bay Area counties. It also has a larger proportion of people able to work remotely. And as a result, when we look in San Francisco County, we see quite depressed levels of arrests that never really rebound. Whereas when we look at another county such as Kern, we see mobility rebounds actually quite a bit more than the state averages. And as a result, we see increases in arrests as well. I think this is interesting because it also plays into the fact that when you've done some of your work, you've highlighted that in 2020, San Francisco actually had the most dramatic decline in property and violent offenses, whereas other counties that had less changes in mobility had smaller increases.
Yeah, among those large counties, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so we are almost out of time, but we have time for one more question. So this one is from Sarah Pace, who's a staff attorney with Northern California Innocence Project at Santa Clara University School of Law. It appears that the economic impacts of COVID on the public, that's people losing housing, is not reflected in these trends, as you would think that economic depression would lead to more arrests. People are driven to possibly then desperate means. Can you speak to that?
Because this is a descriptive analysis, we haven't been able to disentangle some of the economic effects versus what we would expect in like misdemeanors and felonies. What we are able to see is that the reduction in arrests is primarily from drug and driving offenses and not necessarily from property offenses. So perhaps that could be suggestive evidence that maybe those crimes weren't as impacted by the declines in mobility.
Great, thank you. All right, so with that, we have come to the end of our program, and I would like to thank Thomas for opening our event and Deepak for his excellent presentation. I would also like to thank our funders, and finally and importantly, thanks to all of you for joining us here today online. If you pre-register for this event, later today you will receive a survey, and we would really appreciate if you take a couple of minutes to respond to let us know how we did. Please be safe and have a good afternoon.